The IUP Library's Crimson Scholars would like to present a book by Alex Rogue-Magnoli and Dr. John Pignucci.
Well, Alex, we're here to talk about the book, Enter the Superheroes. So, the place to get started is really with kind of a long-standing problem that superhero comics have, which is that people think superheroes are just for kids. And we have an interesting scholar, Douglas Wolk. He's an art critic, really, but he's real interested in comic books as well. And he kind of gave us a starting point for thinking about how to do this book. His quote, or one of the quotes he took from his book, is really kind of lays out the essential problem with superhero comics and how they work. He says superheroes are the public and private shame of American comics. They're a Peter Pan facade that refuses to grow up. They're sort of the idiot cousin that the whole family resents for being the one who supports them, and they don't want to talk about it.
It's interesting to note that he's also one of the scholars who decides the Eisners, which is the equivalent of the Academy Awards for graphic novels and comic books every year. So the fact that he, as a person who decides or nominates a lot of graphic novels and comic books for awards, kind of devalues the genre of superheroes. It's an interesting situation.
And so that's been sort of the ongoing problem then, that superhero comics just don't get much academic respect. I directed a dissertation by Marie Romanelli in IUP's Composition and TESOL doctoral program. And so she looked actually at how students read comics and graphic novels and what happens to them when they do that. Interviewed a bunch of people and looked at their reading habits. And she defined what she called outside literacy. That is, it's a sort of literacy act that really doesn't get accepted in the mainstream. Certainly, schools don't often use comics in their curriculum. And what's also interesting in her study is that she finds reading comics takes a number of different multimodal literacy skills. So you have to decode the pictures, fill in blanks, connect image and word. It's a high level of literacy that's required, but one that sort of challenges our conventional norms.
It's also an interesting idea that she used the word outsider, which kind of stresses the point that comic books are on the fringe of literacy and literature in general. Mm-hmm. And then we went through and we talked about what we felt were the most academically accepted graphic novels in schools. And we came up with a list of our own, and that included Mouse by Art Spiegelman, mm-hmm. Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi, Palestine by Joe Sacco, Pride of Baghdad by Brian K. Vaughan, mm-hmm. American-Born Chinese, by Jean Lewin Yang, and A Contract with God by Will Eisner. And finally, we had Watchmen by Alan Moore. And it's really important to note that Watchmen is the only superhero graphic novel on our list, because, as many readers already know, Watchmen really deconstructs the superhero and breaks it down into absolute pieces.
Right. So, and interestingly enough, Entertainment Weekly just released its own top 10 graphic novels of all time. You look at their list, of course, Mouse, which is the only graphic novel ever to win a Pulitzer Prize. And then, of course, they changed the rules right after that so that no comic could ever win the Pulitzer Prize again. Mouse is always number one. And the rest of this list is similar to ours. But Watchmen, which was number 5 on their list, is the only superhero comic that ever gets any respect. Because basically it says superheroes would never work if they were real. It's a disaster.
The only superhero graphic novel that is accepted is the one that says they would not work. So
in society.
Yeah.
Okay. I think one of the reasons for that is that traditionally literary scholars have and other academic scholars have preferred a certain kind of narrative or a kind of work. And so often the great literature of our time, of all time, falls into certain kinds of trends, so that they usually are based on real historical events, tragedies, of course, versus comedies, grounded in reality. You don't find among the great literary canonized works as many magical realism or other kinds of supernatural works. And usually there's a question about human value systems and working through all these things, kind of real-world angst problems. Watchmen kind of fits that because it says, look, these superheroes are riddled with making poor choices that hurt people and cause all kinds of problems in society.
Even the other graphic novel that's superhero related that is generally accepted, I think, is The Dark Knight Returns. And even that has a depressing vibe to it. It's very, very, this didn't work, and he comes back out of retirement. It's
Right.
very dark.
Now, we don't want to say that those kind of powerful themes, which we've been interested in for eons, are not important. They certainly are. But we also think that graphic novels, and in particular superhero graphic novels and comics, offer something else that's very, very unique and interesting. So that's kind of where we take off of the book.
So we also touched upon Mouse by Art Spiegelman. And we talked about that because it is the most talked about graphic novel in academia. If you ever take a course in graphic novels or comic literature or anything of that sort, you're most likely going to read Mouse by Art Spiegelman. It's the tale of the author's grandfather being in the concentration camps, and he has all the characters anthropomorphized. Is that?
Mm-hmm.
And he has the Nazis as cats and the Jewish people as mice. And it's a very, very deep and very rich story about the Holocaust. The only thing we say about it, though, is that it's really the only book, or one of the only graphic novels, I shouldn't say only, one of the only graphic novels that is really revered. And we're not saying it should be not read, we're saying that it should be read, but there is other literature out there. And we're saying it's time to kind of think beyond Mouse, still value it, still honor it, still read it, but to look beyond it and not simply privilege it as the sole graphic novel of value.
So our own book then, and it's Superheroes, just came out this summer, 2013, from Roman and Littlefield. Scarecrow Press is the imprint. And it takes up first this general question about superhero stories and their acceptance within the Academy. We argue about how they have been disenfranchised and why they should be considered and given full kind of literary privileging and study. And then we look to see what happens once you start to do that, because there are a lot of really interesting and kind of unique elements to superhero stories that you just don't find in other kinds of genres. Okay.
So the battle between fans and creators is a chapter we wrote about how fans really have a vested interest, both financially and emotionally, into the characters that they read about and they watch movies on. It's a unique conflict that exists between the two. And it's really an evolution from letters to the editor to the internet forums and the internet message boards. 40 years ago, when fans would write letters to the editor, it was a big deal to get your letter accepted by Stan Lee or all the other editors of DC. And it was really, really cool. You could say, man, I got my letter into the editor, and now I'm really criticizing and really got some questions about Spider-Man. But now anybody can go online and just make a username and go online and really complain or critique or praise. And it's really led to a culture where, an internet comic book culture where fans have some sort of impact on what.
In fact, just recently, because Christian Bale is stepping out of the Batman role, it was announced that Ben Affleck was going to take over, and there was all kinds of outcry about, oh, he can't do that.
People lost their minds.
Right. There was similar outcry when Michael Keaton was first announced for the role way back, but in those days you didn't have forums all over that lots and lots of people could post to back and forth and have these debates.
And we actually brought up the example of, there was a Wonder Woman pilot in 2011 that was created, and Wonder Woman in the show was the first picture shown of her, she was wearing pants. And the traditional attire for Wonder Woman is she wears the kind of the bloomers that have the white stars and the blue. And fans completely rejected it. They really lost their minds. And it became such an issue that they actually canceled the pilot.
Right. The series was not picked up. I think partly because there was so much outcry. Now you would think, well, what's the big deal? It's pants or shorts. How much difference can it make? I think what's interesting for us is the fact that unlike other genres, where an author just decides to write the book the way he wants, in this case, these characters, because they're part of the general cultural milieu, when a character, we start messing with it even a little, people start to react, and that can cause problems. People, a lot of money's at stake. People get nervous about what might happen and that the show is going to flop. So they shied away from it. It's actually sort of linked to one of the reasons we haven't had a Wonder Woman movie yet, even though the original show with Linda Carter was highly popular back in the 70s.
And then another example we had was, fans of my age will know this, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. They're going to make a movie about them, and they said they were going to change the origin story, that they were aliens. And there was such a backlash that they actually canceled production for a little bit. I mean, now they've actually continued it, and there are pictures of the guys in the big dotted suits and everything for the digital. But basically, it slowed down production.
Yeah. We call it a battle, actually, because the fans and the creators sort of, there's back and forth. And that's kind of the interesting point in an era where so much stuff gets created. You know, you can have publishing worldwide, but big publishing that reaches mass audiences, it's interesting to see that give and take among those forces. It leads to something else, which is the comic relaunch. So superheroes have really been going for at least 70 years since Superman was launched back in 1939, right? 1938.
Batman's 39.
So it's a long, long time to keep telling the same stories over and over. And, you know, this becomes a challenge for the writers and other creators of superhero stories that, how do you keep it going? You know, we've had a million superheroes, over 700 issues of Superman today. Actually, how far is it now? We're closing on 1,000.
Well, we did a number, and it was something like between Superman and Action Comics together, I think it was 1,500 something. The numbers in the book, I can't remember where.
So lots and lots of these stories. And so artists come in and writers come in and say, well, we got to do something different, something new. I can't just keep telling the same old story. So they often do what they call a relaunch or a reboot, which is you try to start everything over. As an example, Spider-Man in the comic books has been married a long time to his love of his life, Mary Jane Watson. And when he was originally created, he was a teenager in high school. He had a lot of love problems. You know, girls didn't like him. He was always having problems. He was an outsider, a geek, the original geek. And so the writer said, well, that's the heart of that character. He shouldn't have this gorgeous model as a wife. That doesn't fit. So they tried to start it all over. And they did this convoluted storyline called Brand New Day, in which Spider-Man has to go to hell and he's making a deal with the devil to save his Aunt May, and he loses his wife in the process.
But it's important to note that they did that because in real life, they would just get a divorce.
Right.
And if they just get a divorce, that really diminishes their value as characters because they're supposed to be perfect and they have the wonderful marriage. So when he selflessly sacrifices his marriage for his Aunt May, they still hold their virtue, they still hold their values intact, but they still break them up. But the other interesting thing is, and it leads to our next thing about continuity, is all the characters in Marvel, as they're all interconnected, have to acknowledge the fact that they're not married anymore, and it convoluted everything, and it was absolute nonsense.
Maybe we should say a quick word for those who don't know this idea of continuity. So superheroes exist in a world in which they supposedly know all the other superheroes. So Spider-Man and the Hulk and Captain America and the Avengers, they're all in a universe, the Marvel universe, or the DC universe, which is Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman, and those characters. So writers try to make sure that if Superman gets injured in his book, Superman, that Batman will know that he's hurt and maybe not able to fight.
He'll reference it.
Right. And so, for instance, if Superman disappears for a while, it makes it much more dangerous for the rest of the heroes because you don't have the most powerful character anymore for a little bit. That's called continuity. You got to keep going back. Yeah. If somebody gets hurt 5 issues earlier, the heroes have to at least acknowledge it. So, Alfred the butler got hurt. He's not helping, so I'm having to cook myself. Big problem for rich guys, like Bruce Wayne.
Big problem for Bruce Wayne.
Okay, so anyway, that creates, over time, 70 years, you got a lot to keep track of, and so they're also trying to restart all that stuff. It goes back to the early days of when literature was serialized. So Charles Dickens, Tale of Two Cities, a lot of his stuff appeared in magazines, literary magazines. You'd read a chapter, and then the next week you'd read another chapter, and so on.
And it was done for the masses so they could afford, because the price of a published book was so maddeningly expensive.
Right.
So you could buy newspapers or little short pamphlets, and you could collect them. And really, that's the beginning of collecting.
Right.
Because you had to get all the issues to read the entire story.
Yeah.
And then the other thing we wanted to mention was Umberto Eco and his idea of reaching toward final consumption. The idea that Umberto Eco wrote a seminal work on superheroes back in the early 70s. And he said that Superman can never end because if he did, the readers would reach toward final consumption, that was his quote, in their mind. And they would resolve all of his adventures and all of his actions. And if they do that, the character loses all influence. So if he continues and continues and continues, then he keeps his value as he goes.
Right. So we never quite know what's going to happen with those stories.
Right.
That partly because these heroes keep going. And Superman, in fact, Time Magazine at one point looked at the 5 most influential fictional characters in the world. Superman's one of those 5, along with Robin Hood and Sherlock Holmes, Tarzan, and Mickey Mouse is actually the 5th one. So they have this widespread cultural impact, not only in the United States, but across the world. And everybody knows, you can just see the S, and you know that's Superman's logo. It has an iconographic power to it. The costumes do that, and Superman, Captain America, those in particular, and you can see some of that color scheme represented in the book. The bright primary colors,
Right.
Which also, in the cases of Superman and Captain America, represent U.S.
Right.
Red, white, and blue is there. That bright stuff really has an impact on people.
Also, the idea that they really wear their values on their sleeves. The fact that he wears the big S, which I guess in the movie now they're saying, and Mark Waid has said this before in Birthright, was that the S meant hope. So
Right.
he wore his hope on his chest, and he was
yeah.
always this symbol for, I guess, hopefulness.
Right.
And then the other thing we talked about was the movie costumes, because that's a really interesting thing to bring up, because I mean, now Batman is entirely in black. That's not a big deal. But when that happened in the 80s with Michael
It's a big
Keaton,
change.
it was such a huge change because Batman for 50 years at that point had been gray with the blue, and it was very, very traditional with the spandex and all that.
Right.
And then they changed it to be a practical suit. And what does that mean for characters going forward in
Yeah,
reality?
that's, of course, the joke about superheroes, they wear spandex and tights. They look ridiculous. And so that's been an ongoing problem. And in fact, once you try to film something, the very impractical nature of those costumes comes out. There was a show a few years back, Birds of Prey, about the Huntress, who is Batman in the Batman universe, a female Batman character. And so she was wearing a superheroine suit, and we'll talk a minute about how problematic those are. But she was trying to run around. She said, I can't run around in this suit, because it's too constricting. It has all these problems to try and fight crime in a ridiculous outfit. So partly as we transition to films and we're starting to see the characters in real life, in a sense, they have to think about changing them. The X-Men changed to sort of all leather, which makes a lot more sense.
But they also, we mentioned the fact that The Matrix came out at almost the exact same time. And The Matrix was really a new superhero for a new age. And if you notice, he's entirely in black. There's no emblem, and there's no really, there is a suit up scene, but it's not like, oh, get the gloves on.
Right.
He's just like, I got to go and do what I have to do. So it's very, almost an anti-hero.
Yeah. And that trend towards black versus the primary bright stuff. You can hide out. This is a good point then to also talk a little bit, as we do in the book, about female superheroes and what we call their hypersexualization. So, of course, they wear really skimpy outfits, and none of the characters, both male or female, look like real people, right? They're all...
even the males look like bodybuilder superhero wrestlers.
Right,
so, even their body image is completely impractical.
So we kind of talk about that problem and the idea of powerful women versus women who are seen as sex objects. And it's been a challenge. I think it's certainly initially created a very male readership for comics, and that's long been the case. But as these heroes have transitioned to the big screen, it's reaching a much wider audience of both males and females. And you see in the Avengers, for instance, the Black Widow, who wears
but her
a more...
suit was more practical.
Right, it's much more practical. Yeah.
And the idea of Wonder Woman's suit being completely impractical in a war situation, and you compare it to Batman in the movies where he actually talks about the militarization of the suit and why he picked that one, and then you have Wonder Woman who wears literally a glorified bathing suit. So it's...
I think, so that remains a problem in terms of helping the stories to move out to the broadest of audiences. And I do know, having taught a few classes on comics, with both male and female students saying, the way these characters, particularly female characters, get depicted in the artwork often is, emphasizing sexual nature of the character in some problematic ways.
And we're going to get to that with the diversity chapter as well.
We have a whole chapter then to deal with that problem.
So then we talked about superhero storytelling and how that is really a unique aspect of superhero literature. Because there's not only is there a relationship between the words and the images, as it is the case with all multimodal media, the idea that we have to kind of accept or interpret different modes of communication, there's also a relationship between the writer and the artist. And that leads to a lot of sometimes friction. And we talk about the Marvel method with Stan Lee back in the 60s. The way the Marvel method worked was Stan Lee would literally give a story to an artist, whether it was Jack Kirby or Bill Everett or Steve Ditko or whoever, and he would say, I just don't have time to do this right now. I need you to really get the story down, and then you send it to me, and I'll get the words in. The problem was the writer or the artist would actually really mold the story with their images, and they'd send it to Stan Lee, and Stan Lee would put written by Stan Lee. And at the time, that was fine because everybody was like, well, we need to work, and that's okay. But as years went on, some of the artists, including Kirby, and I think Ditko,
Steve Ditko,
Ditko tried to sue. Yeah, they tried to sue Stan Lee and Marvel, saying that we created these characters.
There's a lot of ownership questions because, of course, these characters and the rights to those characters, they're worth millions of dollars. There's still a battle between DC Comics and the creators of Superman, Joe Simon and
Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster.
Yes.
The estates have sued.
The estates have sued, yeah. And then between the artists over Spider-Man, some of the other big characters. We're real interested in this because we're both in composition as our professional area. And so in composition studies, the study of writing, for a long time we've said that writing really doesn't exist in the solitary garret of the writer working on his own. This is the old view of writing, that you sit in a library somewhere on your own and don't talk to anybody and just write. Okay, that's kind of gone away, and we're much more interested now in talking to other people in the library, but also writing and working with other people. So there's a collaborative nature to writing that's really inherent in it. And people like Eden Lunsford, compositionists, have talked about we need to really emphasize that notion. Now, in the comic world, professionally, they've been doing that for a long time. The big story arcs, in fact, the entire company at DC, they'll have a retreat. Everyone goes there for a long weekend, and all the writers and artists talk about where are we going with this? What's going to happen? A big event like when Captain America dies, that's planned out well in advance.
But also, when you see the covers and talking about the death of Captain America, you don't see just Ed Brubaker. Even though he's the writer, you see Ed Brubaker and you see Steve Epting, and you see all the artists and writers, and sometimes you'll even see three titles or three names, because it's really a collaboration. Nothing can be done on its own, but that also brings up interesting points in terms of authorship, like you were just saying with Eden Lunsford.
And we were talking before about continuity. It's trying to keep things straight. So if Captain America dies, well, what happens to everybody after that point? And so there's a notion then of the fixed compositional point.
And this goes to, I love Doctor Who. I don't know if you know Doctor Who, but you
I like
don't love
Doctor
it.
Who.
Okay, so Doctor Who, in his episode, I think it's called, I can't remember the name of the episode, but it doesn't matter. He says that there are fixed composition, or there's fixed points in time where nothing can ever change. So he's a time traveler, and he goes to these certain points, and his companion will say, you need to change this. And he goes, I can't. This is a point in time where I can't change it. And we took that concept and we expanded it to being a fixed compositional point, which would be the origin stories or certain major events of characters' histories.
Right.
So, for example, when artists and writers redo the Superman story, the Spider-Man story, or any character, Peter Parker always has to be bitten by a radioactive spider. Always. Superman always has to come from Krypton and have the planet blown up. Bruce Wayne always has to have his parents die. And the other thing is, this goes with the Resonant Tropes by Peter Coogan. The idea that there are images that always repeat themselves, such as Martha Wayne's pearls falling. Like every single time that Bruce's parents die, there's that image, and it's repeated and repeated, and that's our fixed compositional point.
So it's interesting then between that collaborating about changing stuff, but also having to think about certain things we have to maintain. Another chapter we look at is the importance of superheroes and children and children's learning. Of course, we started out by saying, here's the problem, people think superheroes are only for kids. And so that's certainly an issue for us. But at the same time, superheroes are for kids, partly, and so that really has an impact on the way children develop. Certainly, toys are rife with superhero imagery and superhero toys. Costumes, this Halloween, those will be the most popular costume, the Avengers and Superman. They're already out at the stores. So those kind of things are still going, and that has a real impact on kids and the way kids play. And Vivian Paley did a book about several books on superheroes in the Dallas Corner, looking at the way superheroes shape how kids think about things. The problem for a long time was that people worried, superheroes are too violent. There's too much fighting.
But the point is, when children play with superheroes, they do have a violent aspect, but they don't play out the scene where Bruce's parents get killed in the alleyway.
Right.
They'll do the scene where they go and stop a bank robbery, and they'll play like that. The other thing is that superhero literature has really moved, in terms of children's exposure to it, from comic books to television and some
Particularly
case
animated
movies.
series,
Animated. Comic books anymore are really adult focused.
Oriented, yeah.
They're really
Adult
adult-oriented.
themed, yeah.
And that goes back to the early 80s, late 70s, when they started creating comic shops for the direct market and adults being able to pick what they wanted. But superheroes still influence children, just not so much with comic books anymore, really with television shows and movies at some level.
In fact, this has become a bit of an issue for the comic industry itself because you have an aging readership.
Yeah.
The people who read them as kids, like Alex and I, are still reading them, but there aren't as many little kids anymore reading comics. They're more likely to watch.
It's almost they have to
yeah.
make a direct line where they'll say, this is for children. These ones are for children, but the regular ones aren't. Honestly, they're not for children.
Yeah. You don't want to buy the average comic.
You don't want to buy the
today for
Killing
your-
Joke for your 10-year-old.
Exactly. So it becomes very interesting. I think the other thing is, though, that and research on children and play has found that kids actually use comic and other kinds of play to work through problems. So they deal with or think about problems, challenges, scary things like people dying. They work through some of those issues in the play that they do, which is some of the research that we've talked about.
And we also looked into diversity in superheroes, which is quite admittedly limited because the sociocultural history of comic books is unfortunately quite monocultural.
Right.
And we wanted to take 2 case studies because we felt it was unfair and unrealistic to really tackle the entire issue of diversity in superheroes in just one chapter.
Right.
So the 2 case studies that we talked about were Miles Morales becoming Spider-Man in the Ultimate Universe. Miles Morales is half black, half Hispanic. And we also talked about the depiction of Starfire, a character from the Teen Titans, and Catwoman in the Batman world in DC's reboot called The New 52. And the one thing about the Miles Morales situation was it was really progressive.
Yeah.
Peter Parker had died in the Ultimate world of Marvel. And when he died, a young man named Miles Morales, who we just mentioned, becomes Spider-Man. And it's really an interesting take on the character because it's really not about him being half black or half Hispanic. It's really about him just taking up the mantle of Spider-Man and becoming a great superhero.
Right.
It's a really positive
This
story.
is an old trope in the comics.
Right.
When one character dies or something happens, they're incapacitated, somebody else has to take up the cape
Right.
and wear the cowl. And so there's just a transition. So actually in the comic, they deal with it in a very natural way. That Morales just
picks it up.
dons the costume and off he goes. There's no question of, well, should he represent him or not? He just does it. And that's sort of in the writer saying, we just move on. There's no issue there.
Yeah.
But of course, in the larger context, it was a big issue of discussion of whether or not Morales should get
Going
to be
back to
Spider-Man.
the battle between fans and creators, when that happened, the boards and all those message things, they all blew up. They were like, what? Peter Parker's Spider-Man. There's no way we can have this guy be... But it's turned out fine. It's actually become one of the more popular characters.
Right.
And then the
It's a
other...
terrific book.
Yeah. And then the other thing was Starfire and Catwoman in the DC New 52. This wasn't necessarily the best reboot ever.
Some very problematic issues. So we wanted to hit on how bad things can get. Starfire, in particular, is way over-sexualized, and that's always a problem, particularly with that character. What the writers do is say, well, she's an alien, and so she has an alien set of values.
But her alien set of values includes asking some unsuspecting guy, do you want to have sex with me?
Right.
And he goes,
Very problematic.
Yeah.
So I don't want to condone that set of values in particular. They're alien values. I think it was interesting for the writers to try and deal with that, and then to see the way they try to justify some of those decisions, which may or may not be good. Catwoman is a much more successful character, and over time has become a lot more independent. There was a Catwoman, rather unfortunate film, not very well done. But she's
the Halle Berry?
The Halle Berry movie. We'll try to forget about that. But Catwoman is one of the characters, a kind of unique female character, in fact, in that she sort of exists on her own. So often, female characters are just female versions of a male character. Batgirl, Supergirl, they're just redone with a female figure. Catwoman is her own character in a sense, and really has gained a certain amount of independence over time, and shifted sometimes from being Jewel Thief was her original take, to being
she's become one of his closest confidants in the stories.
Yeah.
But the big thing about the New 52 was that at the end of her first issue, they're she and Batman are having sex on the page. And that was kind of a big shock moment because for so many years it had been tacitly implied that they had a relationship, and it was kind of a really cool sexual tension they did.
Right.
And then it was just like they're having sex, and it was
it was always a sort of cat and mouse,
cat
of
and
course,
mouse, right.
playing between Batman and Superman, or Batman and Catwoman, whether they were in love, and was never quite fully formed. It's always a tension. It sort of gets resolved in some problematic ways. To go back to the Echo stuff that we were looking at. So probably the other thing, and I think this is another reason people sometimes make fun of superheroes, is they never die, right? Nobody ever really dies. Superman's died, Captain America died.
I think all of them have died at one point
At some
or another.
point. There's a long
There's a long list.
At the same time, though, it becomes a really, really interesting literary motif, which is unique to superheroes. We go through these death stories. When Captain America died, it was a national news item, and especially because Captain America as a character had linkages to World War II. A lot of veterans read that when they were soldiers in the war. He embodied all of our American values of the time. And so when he died, it really was sort of a moment. It's like, well, has America died, in a sense? And, what happens then if our hero is gone? It gets worked through in the comics, and his young protege Bucky, who would come back as the Winter Soldier, takes up the shield eventually and carries on the American way.
But we also talk about the death of Superman as being really the precedent. Superheroes had died before, but when Superman died in 1992 in the comics, that was a big deal. CNN had been covering it, and I can tell you, as a reader, I think I would have been 9. My father brought it home for me. And my mother always likes to remind me of this. I cried when I read that Superman died. Because the other thing was, he didn't die from kryptonite poisoning, or he didn't die because Lex Luthor tricked him. He died because he just got beat so badly that he was a bloody pulp on the street. And it was really a question of...
at the time,
it was horribly vicious, So it was really a question of, is this really our superhero? Is this how we respect them and how we treat them? And is this really what the embodiment of American culture has really become? Just the guy who's beaten up on the ground. So the question became, why do we kill these superheroes?
Right.
And we had 2 reasons. The first reason was that, one, going back to the continuity idea, superheroes have been around for so long, we got to do something with them. We can't have Flash be Captain Cold every single issue. So what do we do with them? We kill them, because in that world they can come back.
And we could start over.
Right. And then
which lets you wipe the slate clean. So from a writer's perspective, it can be useful.
It's a really useful plot device. But the other thing is, would DC really kill Superman forever and never bring him back?
No.
Well, no, because Superman is a financial cash cow. There's no way that they would just kill him to kill him.
Right. They can't afford it. And in particular, at the time Superman died, DC as a company was struggling. Today, they're multi-billion-dollar licensing companies. All those characters are worth so much money in the films. But
it's also interesting to note that Batman had been paralyzed, 6 months later? So in a span of less than a year, they had killed Superman, and then they had paralyzed Batman. So their 2 main characters, they had completely taken off the map.
Right.
And then this goes into the idea of are there any true deaths in comics, in superhero comics?
Yeah, and I think going back to, we were talking about the fixed compositional point, there are 2 things that you can't change. One is that Bruce Wayne's, Batman's parents, the Waynes, Martha and Thomas and Wayne. No, not Martha. Is it Martha?
No, Martha and Thomas.
Martha and Thomas Wayne can never be killed, or always have to be killed. That's the way Batman starts. It's not that a bat flies into his room and he decides to be Batman just like that. It's that his parents have died and he witnesses that event, a traumatic event as a child, and it forever scars him, forever changes who he is, and puts him on this vengeful path. The other death that always has to remain true is that Uncle Ben, Spider-Man's uncle, Peter Parker's uncle, has to die. Because it's Spider-Man's fault. He could have stopped the robber who eventually kills his uncle, but he chooses not to at the time because he's selfish. He doesn't want to get involved. And so later, when the robber shoots his uncle, he realizes that with great power comes great responsibility. The famous line about Spider-Man. And so that has to happen because Spider-Man, from that point on, becomes a character, the ultimate selfless character. He's always about helping other people.
We also mentioned Gwen Stacy as
right.
being one of the characters that truly dies.
So those are very interesting. I think as we near the finish of the book, we also touched on a little bit on technology. And so Iron Man, which was popular, the Batman film had come out at the same time. Dark Knight Returns was the mega film of that year. But also Dark Knight
Yeah,
Rises, yeah. But also Iron Man had come out. And the cool thing about Iron Man is, now it would be great to be a multi-billionaire and handsome like Robert Downey Jr., but you could just put on that suit and become Iron Man. You don't have to look like a movie star. You could just get the suit and wear it, which, in fact, in the later films, his friend Roddy does that. So technology becomes an interesting thing that it's shaping and pushing us a little closer towards that world of
reality.
superheroes. Yeah. Captain America we were talking about before, they use a super soldier serum, some sort of steroid stuff that makes him super. And so there's always a sense that maybe our technology could get us there. And so we explore that. Batman, of course, early on and in the TV show in the 60s, he had a lot of gadgets. He was always using
It was
stuff.
always about the utility belt.
Right. This or that thing.
And if he lost the utility belt, he was useless.
Right. Yeah. So that becomes really interesting. We look at that. Even the cell phone today sort of comes out of the world of Star Trek, right? We were talking to Siri. They were talking to Siri a long time ago before Apple invented it. I think, though, even in terms of technology, of course, we can't go down, a store yet and buy an Iron Man outfit, but maybe a couple years down the road. We bid for it on eBay if we could. But I think one of the things that does happen is that gets out there and we think about it, shapes our thinking about heroes, and that's an interesting potential. There is a great, though, old Super Friends episode called Trial of the Super Friends, in which they're captured, Batman, Green Lantern, and Wonder Woman, and Robin, captured, and their weapons are taken away. So they lose their utility belts, Wonder Woman loses her golden lasso, and they take away Green Lantern's ring. And, of course, in the end, the heroes triumph because ultimately to be a hero, it's not about the technology. You just have to be heroic. So we can all do that. So we touch on a lot of different stuff in that particular chapter. That leads up to the kind of finish of the book.
Leads us to the idea that we wanted to create a canon of superhero literature. We wanted to establish what we thought was a great list of works that would really reflect what the characteristics and the values of superhero literature are and were. And that led us to the idea of looking at Harold Bloom, who has some problems in terms of his canon, but he was a good model to look at. Harold Bloom wrote a book in 1990, I think it's 5 or 1994, about the Western canon. And he came up with a huge list of what he said were the ultimate works of Western culture.
Yeah. Needed to sort of become culturally knowledgeable.
Right.
And I should say that in the realm of English, or the field of English, we've certainly critiqued that notion.
Yes.
It's problematic. As soon as you start making a list, people say, well, you missed this, this, and this. That's problematic. So we're aware of that. At the same time, we're very worried about the fact that when Entertainment Weekly makes its list, it's only got one superhero book on there. Well, that's not okay with us. And so we said we ought to draw attention to these more important superhero stories that are out there.
And the idea with Bloom, yeah, absolutely, but the idea with Bloom was that he had one really, really good point.
Yeah.
And he said that canons only exist because we only live so long.
Right.
We can only read so much stuff in our lifetimes. And that brings us to the other point when we were talking about Superman and Action Comics having, I think, 1,500 issues. And that's just Superman. That doesn't include other stories, single stories, stories where he appears with other people. Yeah, team-ups.
Team books.
It's insane the amount of stuff. So what we said was, he's absolutely right in that regard, that there's only so much time we have on Earth to read. So these are the stories that we felt were most reflective and most representative of the characteristics and the values that we were talking about throughout the book. And again, we want to stress that this is not a bucket list.
Right.
This isn't a thing where we go, you have to read every single one of these books. No, because one time we mentioned Smallville. I'm a big Smallville fan. I know it gets a lot of crap, but I love Smallville. And I'm not saying go watch all 200-something episodes.
10 seasons.
Yeah, 10 seasons worth. Just watch a few of them. Get the idea of what it's about.
Right.
And this canon was created to recognize what texts have contributed to making the genre of superheroes socioculturally significant.
Right. Yeah. We did try to expand, so we've talked a lot about books and comics, graphic novels, but also we're interested in other ways that superheroes exist. So early radio stories, Superman actually starts flying because he was a radio show, and it was just easier to move him around if he could fly rather than jump around, which was his
up and away.
appearance. Yep. Certainly we've been talking about films, television shows, Super Friends, Superhero Squad, which is a popular show now.
Batman, the animated series, which has become one of the
all-time
pure
greats.
premier Batman stories.
So those things are on there. We just were recently reviewed by, or we had a book review, and the writer was saying that he thinks it represents a sort of new take on the humanities, a way to sort of blend academic concerns with pop cultural concerns, trying to do it in a kind of cool way. And so it's that blending of things everybody's interested in and academic values which we're interested in as professionals. So that brings in a lot of those kinds of issues and helps us sort of look at that within the canon, different kinds of great stories.
And superheroes really offer a lot of issues for exploration in the Academy. We had the idea of goodness, virtue, identity. That's a big one. The idea of vigilantism, revenge. What really constitutes what is acceptable and what is not. Is it okay to kill people when you're a vigilante? Is it not? That whole idea. There's a lot of duality. There's a lot of power.
Yeah.
All these themes are really explored in a really unique way with superhero literature. And we're not saying it's not explored in traditional literature and other media, but we're saying that superheroes really offer a really unique way to explore these themes and issues.
Yeah.
And then just to give an example, we talked about one story in particular was Born Again.
He's a big Daredevil fan.
I'm a big
so we
Daredevil
had to
fan.
throw
I'm like
that
one
in.
of 8. I love Daredevil. But the idea that this is just to give an example of how we really went through the idea of creating the canon. A story called Born Again. Daredevil is taken out of his costume, out of his suit. He's no longer in the Red Devil outfit. He's completely become destitute because of the Kingpin, taking away all of his resources. And the point is, the writer, Frank Miller, and the artist, Mazzucchelli, really took the character and deconstructed him to the absolute base of his existence. And then the story was about him building back up. So we really saw that as a story about identity, where he didn't have his secret identity anymore, and he really had to struggle through that. Power, he lost all of his resources, but he still came back. So that was one of the ways that we really went through the idea of creating the canon. This would be an example of how we actually created the canon and chose
And it's a nice example of a fabulous book that's well worth reading and that you could read in any college course or any high school course and get a lot of merit out of. We broke up the canon into a number of different ages. Partly we looked at Peter Coogan, we mentioned earlier, a comic studies scholar who has different ages. And we talk about early appearances that set precedents for how characters are supposed to be shaped. The Silver Age, where we started kind of linking heroes to contemporary issues.
That was also the DC reimagining, where they were Julius Schwartz did the science characters instead of the magical characters.
Yeah. And Green Lantern, Green Arrow, which brought in questions about drug use as a superhero got addicted to drugs. Later, that sort of, actually some of that falls into the Bronze Age, the social consciousness. We have a real dark age, which comes up where Superman gets killed and Batman's back gets broken.
This is also Watchmen, Dark Knight Returns, and Death of Captain Marvel, all that stuff.
Really sort of dark, depressing stuff where people are dying. And then finally, what we call our own term, the heroic age, where we sort of get back to that core set of values about good always wins.
And we took that idea from Marvel, because Marvel a few years ago had not really a reboot, but they had kind of christened their series, and they called it the Heroic Age, and that we're going back to the traditional stories and everything. So we kind of took that idea of the Heroic Age and kind of applied it to the books that we're referring to. The other thing I want to note is that Peter Coogan has a very similar structure of his ages, and we just wanted to say that we respect that, but we just changed the Dark Age and the Heroic Age.
Yeah. Kind of cover a couple other issues.
And then we have some examples of what the canon is.
Right.
So we have 2 examples from each one. The Golden Age, Action Comics #1, of course, the first appearance of Superman, and Detective Comics #27, which is the first appearance of Batman. Again, establishing the precedence of who the heroes are. Silver Age, we have more stories that are really first appearances, but this is also the rise of Marvel. Amazing Fantasy 15, which is where Spider-Man comes in. And then we even said Fantastic Four #52, where the Black Panther first makes his appearance. The idea of
one of the first African-American superheroes.
Spreading out. Also, finally, or on this page, the Bronze Age, we had Iron Man, Demon in a Bottle. That's where the famous story of Iron Man becoming an alcoholic. Really tackling
issues. And it affects his ability to be a hero.
Yep. And then finally, we had the Adams and O'Neill, Denny O'Neill and Neil Adams stories of Green Lantern and Green Arrow.
Yeah, which you mentioned. Dark Age, that Daredevil story we were talking about would fall into there. The Killing Joke, famous story about the Joker. He kills Barbara Gordon.
Well, he paralyzes her.
Paralyzes her. She goes into a wheelchair after that. Tortures Commissioner Gordon. And sort of pushes Batman to want to kill him. And so he's faced with the question of, do I actually
Right.
do that? You know, partly you say, well, get rid of him. He's psychotic. The world will be better without Joker. But there's a problem
It's keeping
with
with the
doing
theme
it.
of the dark.
And Commissioner
darkness.
Gordon really says to Batman, you can't do that. That's not who you are. And then more recently, the Heroic Age, where we're looking at, we talked about Death of Captain America, and Kingdom Come, a fabulous futuristic visioning of what happens when the superheroes have sort of taken over the whole world and are running things for the good of all, which is another kind of working of the Watchmen story.
Okay.
Okay. I think kind of as a nice place to end is to think about, with superheroes, one of the things that's most reassuring is, you know, when we think about having these amazing powers, you know, bending metal bars, flying, stopping bullets, doing whatever you want. I think most of us, if you say, well, if I had Superman's powers, I would like take all the money I wanted and do whatever I wanted and eat everything. You could just go, you know, everything would be about me, 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 me. Okay. But in the superhero world, when people get these powers, Spider-Man's the great example, they end up trying to help other people and do good. And we think there's something really important about that.
It's what we think we would do. If
we
we had
want to think we would
superpowers.
do.
It's really the most noble
Yeah.
actions you can take when you get these extreme powers.
Yeah.
And that's why they're important and why they're valuable to really analyze and to study.
Grant Morrison, a great comic book writer who has turned to doing some academic stuff, says, you know, it should give us hope that when we imagine superhero stories, we imagine us doing good with all those powers. So we hope that plays out.
And we create and love superheroes because they are what we hope to become. And that's really another thing from Grant Morrison is we want to be them. And that's why they're so valuable and why they're so important in culture and society.
Right. I think, too, so in crystallizing that point, in terms of academia, it's interesting. A lot of the other sort of dark literature that we look at and the problems that we have, there's something important about that concept of hope. The president has used it in his campaign speeches and been criticized. It's a recurring theme in superhero stories, hope. There's always hope there in the darkest hour.
Brightest day and blackest night.
Brightest day and blackest night. And so that always keeps coming out. The book has a ton of other stuff in there, so you'll be interested to look at that. We've been talking about, Alex and I, about what books ought to be on the top 10 graphic novels. And so I think we'll give a couple suggestions, and then perhaps people want to send an email and bounce some ideas off.
What we said, the top 5 stories that you probably have never read
Right,
that are superhero
right.
related. I said Born Again.
Born Again. We put Death of Captain Marvel in there.
Death of Captain Marvel.
I think X-Men, we were talking about which X-Men book. God Loves, Man Kills.
Or The Days of Future Past.
Days of
That's
Future
going to be a
Past.
movie soon. They're going to do that.
Yeah.
I forgive me, I can't say the word, but it's Wonder Woman
Hecadica.
Hecadica. I can't believe I can't say the word, but that's one of the better ones where Wonder Woman fights Batman.
Tell just a bit about that one for a moment.
All right, Wonder Woman, a young girl commits a crime in Gotham, and she runs to Wonder Woman to cash in, I guess, on some ancient agreement in Greece about having protection. And Wonder Woman agrees to protect her no matter what. And Batman shows up and says, well, you have to give her to me, Diana. And she says, no, I'm following my culture and I'm following my traditions, and you're going to have to fight me to get her.
Yeah.
And they do. And it's really just about keeping your values no matter what.
And maybe one other one I'll throw in then for our top 5 is Identity Crisis, which I think is a fabulous book. There's a lot of back continuity to know, but a hero's wife gets killed. Ralph Dibny, the Elongated Man, who's a Justice League member, his wife gets killed, and the superheroes go after her, after the killer, Dr. Light. But in the process, it comes out that they've been messing with villains' minds to keep them from knowing their real identities. All kinds of identity issues get wrapped up in there. So there's a lot of great books out there, a lot of stuff that we would encourage you to read.
And we encourage suggestions. This is not an end-all, be-all list. It is subject to subtractions, additions, augmentations.
To start.
This is not, And I also want to do one thing real quick. I want to thank the artist of the cover. Alyssa Richmond is an IUP student, an art student. She's actually an art education student, and she did the cover image. And I'd like to thank her for providing the image for the
And
book.
in fact, that will lead to a nice finishing point, which is that on Facebook, you can find our Facebook page, Facebook.com/Enter the Superheroes. And if you go to that page, you can see some of our variant covers done by Alyssa, which are really cool looking, but you can only find them by going to that webpage. So we've enjoyed chatting with you today. We hope to hear from you maybe on email, and take a look at the book.
Thank you very much for having
Thanks
us.
for having us.
Stabley Library.